Now, some strong language as BBC Two goes inside the Enron scandal.
This is the story of two men who conjured up one of the world's biggest companies, and one woman who helped expose their sham. Kenneth Lay and Jeff Skilling dreamt of building a giant energy trading empire, but almost from the start, they found they couldn't do it without making up the numbers.
Telephone calls would come under the guise of some very, very crude instructions like, give me more fucking money.
Margaret Saccone was lured to Enron on the promise of $1 million a year, but she ended up blowing the whistle on the biggest financial scandal ever.
It was like gambling. This is Las Vegas at its finest. It was totally a crapshoot.
Enron has cost savers billions, brought down a global accounting firm, and damaged the careers of top politicians both here and in America. This is a story of greed, power, fear, and false accounting. But was it also a fraud from the outset? Nobody quite knew how they did it. Enron seemed to defy the laws of economics and gravity. In 15 short years, it grew from nothing into an energy trading giant. It had thousands of mysterious subsidiaries and claimed to have sales of $100 billion. When it finally crashed, it left everyone asking, how did they get away with it for so long? To find out, I came to Houston, Texas, the heart of America's energy industry. The story starts in 1985, when the boss of a local gas pipeline company took over one of its rivals. The new company was called Enron, and the boss had big ambitions. His name was Kenneth Lay.
I have known Ken Lay for well over 20 years, and he came from a very poor family in Missouri, bootstrapped himself along and climbing up all the way.
When he came into the company, we thought he was really doing good for the company. You know, we were proud to be part of Enron. You know, we were honored to be an Enron employee.
The Baptist minister's son was determined to get to the top. The American gas industry was being deregulated, and Ken Lay wanted to make the most of it.
Ken Lay is a very bright man. He does have a PhD in economics, and he is a visionary, and he had some grandiose dreams. He hired people that had equally grandiose, if not greater, dreams.
To help his dream come true, Ken Lay turned to management consultants McKinsey and Jeff Skilling, their energy chief.
Jeff Skilling was absolutely brilliant. There's no question about that. He's one of the brightest guys who's ever come out of Harvard Business School.
He is also very arrogant, self-serving, and I think, you know, he wanted to be the best, and he wanted his company to be the best no matter what it took.
Skilling and Lay claimed to the outside world they would build a company based on innovation and aggression, but in a nice way.
Every year, every day, every week, you have to come up with new ideas. It's a tough world out there. It's a very competitive world. There probably are times that there's a desire to cut corners, but we can't have that at Enron.
Enron is a company that deals with everyone with absolute integrity. We play by all of the rules. We stand by our word. We want people to leave a transaction with Enron thinking that they've been dealt with in the highest possible way as far as integrity and truthfulness and really doing our business right.
Colby Yates has got a bull they call Psycho.
Jeff Skilling wanted aggression in the business. His first big new idea was every bit as brutal as a rodeo bull ride. He introduced a staff performance review system where employees were ranked against each other and separated into winners and losers. The losers were ejected. Angelina Lario worked at Enron from the very start and survived the process known as rank or yank.
With the ranking system that Jeff Skilling introduced into the company, it was 20% at the top. You would get excellent bonuses. You were rated, really up there.
Going back to dog face. Yeah!
But if you were ranked at the very, very bottom, which was lower 20%, then you were out the door. You were yanked.
You know, the end of that ride was a little rough.
Every single year you had this to look forward to, and it was the most stressful time, to go through this, because you didn't know whether you were going to have a job or you would have a job. I mean, you just didn't know.
That's a big ball.
Margaret Saccone was a high-flying deal-maker who was offered $1 million a year to come and work for Enron. She, too, had to endure the rank or yank ordeal.
I think it was very brutal. If you worked for somebody that had a lot of influence with senior management, you would usually come out pretty well. But if you didn't and you were not in with the current management team, you could lose your job.
Jeffrey Skilling took an already adrenaline-driven culture and then supercharged it even more and contributed to this competitive culture internally and externally. The company developed a reputation very quickly of being arrogant, being dogmatic.
Rank or yank gave employees every incentive to make the company as much money as possible. By 1990, it was all working well, and Jeff Skilling got his own incentive. Ken Lay took him on full-time as the boss of Enron's main trading division. Skilling's new contract gave him a slice of the market value of the company, so the bigger it grew, the fatter his pay packet. In his first year, Skilling did very well for himself. Thanks to the Gulf War, gas prices soared, and Enron enjoyed bumper profits of $200 million.
Enron just made oodles of money in 1990. The next year was not quite so great. Things were back to normal, but Enron had pledged an earnings growth rate that it wasn't going to be able to achieve based on its existing operations. So the issue was find a new way to make some money.
Skilling's bonus was in doubt. His solution was to come up with some very creative accounting. In 1991, Enron did a deal to supply this power station in New York State with gas for 20 years. The first year's profits alone would not have been enough to boost Enron's overall position. So instead, they declared all 20 years' estimated profits right away. With a few strokes of the pen, their overall profits went up instead of down. Like magic.
By booking all of the profits that they expected to make over 20 years into 1 year, the first year of the deal, they were able to boost their earnings and demonstrate ongoing growth quarter by quarter, always moving upward.
It was as if Enron had placed a huge bet and told the whole world they'd won already, even though the wheel wasn't even spinning yet. At that stage, they couldn't possibly know if their gamble was going to pay off, but even so, they claimed all the winnings they hoped for in their first year's accounts. Amazingly, this ruse is allowed in America under certain circumstances. It's called mark-to-market accounting. Enron took this idea and pushed it to the limit, and then some.
Mark-to-market accounting is a standard practice, but it was intended for shorter-term applications than 10 and 20 years out. It was intended for 2 or 3 years to give companies some way to recognize the earnings from their trading book. But it was misused.
Professor of Economics Robert McCullough is a leading expert on Enron. He and his staff have spent thousands of hours poring over the documents. He believes Enron corrupted the most basic principles of free enterprise, starting with their early accounting tricks.
Abuse of market-to-market accounting is exceedingly easy in new energy markets because we have no published numbers. The numbers Enron was using were assumptions. We found that many of the assumptions and computer models that Enron was using were very arbitrary. In fact, we've heard from some Enron traders that they effectively just made up the numbers in those calculations.
Enron didn't just artificially prop up their profits. They also misled the regulators when they introduced the new technique.
This is the letter Enron wrote to the Securities and Exchange Commission. They said that implementation of mark-to-market accounting would not have any material impact on its earnings for that year. In fact, it really did.
Are you saying they were lying?
I'm saying that their earnings certainly would not have been as high as they reported had they not applied this particular mechanism.
In 1991, mark-to-market accounting generated more than half of Enron's profits growth of $40 million. Lay and Skilling were pleased. Their auditors, Arthur Anderson, approved the accounts. And the outside world was fooled. Enron's accounting tricks had inflated their earnings. This impressed Wall Street and boosted their share price. It was such a good wheeze, they decided to do it again. And again, and again. Each year, the staff who survived Rank or Yank made big bonuses, but some profited twice over. They also gained from the rising share price.
All the senior executives would benefit from the company's performance, so they would be awarded stock options, they would be awarded bonuses based on the performance of the company. So the stronger the performance, the better the stock earnings, and then the better the bonuses.
So the manipulation of the accounts was basically for their benefit?
Well, they certainly did benefit from it. There's no doubt about that.
With the scam working so well, Enron became addicted to rapid growth. They moved on from just supplying gas to trading it speculatively. Then they turned to electricity. But now they were worried about the prying eyes of the authority which regulates commodities trading.
They were just looking for freedom and opportunity.
Luckily, the authority's head, Wendy Graham, ruled that speculative trading in gas and electricity did not need to be regulated. A great break for Enron, and as it turned out, for Wendy too.
She went on Enron's board just weeks after implementing policies at her agency that certainly benefited Enron. And then she goes on the board and reaps the benefits of years and years of director's fees.
I have the best wife in the United States of America.
Coincidentally, is the influential Senator Phil Gramm. He's received nearly $100,000 in funding from Enron since 1989. He's not alone. Enron lined the pockets of 3/4 of Congress to get politicians on side. It was now time for Enron to try the same magic overseas. In 1993, they opened the world's biggest gas-fired power station on Teesside. Ken Lay was there, and guest of honour was Lord Wakeham. As Energy Secretary, Wakeham had given the project the green light.
I'm greatly honoured to be able to say a warm tribute, not just to Enron, but to all of their partners, all old friends of mine, who have been the leaders of the teams that have got this project going.
Kenneth Lay later invited Lord Wakeham to join Enron as a non-executive director. Next, Enron signed a contract to buy gas from the North Sea for 20 years. Enron had to spend £3 million a month to transport the gas through an undersea pipeline. But that's not how they presented it in their accounts. Enron came up with some new accounting tricks to bury costs and inflate their profits. We spoke to a qualified accountant who worked in the trading area at Enron's London office and knows how they did it. He didn't want to be identified, so his words are spoken by an actor.
The cash was flowing out of the company on a monthly basis. They were spending £3 million a month to use the pipeline, but they only recognised £1 million of that as a cost in the accounts. They effectively ignored the other 2 million on the argument that the company could recoup the money at some point in the future. This effectively increased profits by the same amount, £2 million a month.
Enron had bought the right to use the pipeline for 25 years, but did not expect to use it for more than 15 years. They assumed they could sell the remaining 10 years onto somebody else and make a profit. This was a wildly optimistic assumption, although it was approved by Enron's accountants.
At the time it seemed perfectly reasonable. Arthur Anderson, the auditors, reviewed the arrangements and they accepted it. The senior manager accepted it. With hindsight, I think it was certainly unjustifiable. It was a very optimistic guess. It was very aggressive accounting, but the culture was quite aggressive. Later on, I think even management accepted they weren't going to recover the money.
The gas deal quickly went wrong. Prices moved against Enron, but the company was locked in. Altogether, it lost $500 million. In the European offices in London's Victoria, just as in America, Enron was by now building up a huge dealing room operation. Jeff Skilling was turning Enron from an industrial company into a global trading house, buying and selling anything to do with energy. And in London too, there was some very creative bookkeeping. Pierre Horry had never seen anything like it. He ran the department which traded cargo space on ships. At strategic times, Pierre and his colleagues came under intense pressure to cook the books from their American managers.
We would get telephone calls end of each quarter and more telephone calls end of the year. And usually these telephone calls would come under the guise of some very, very crude instructions like, give me more fucking money. What they were meaning by that is, as it was too late to meet targets to do new deals, the only thing left was to change the assumptions under which the existing deals were assessed. And there was an expression in the company which was used, I think, around the world, which was tweaking the knob.
Pierre stresses he did not oblige, but others did. It was for the American boss's benefit.
The remuneration of these people was a direct function of meeting, or even, I think, I'm assuming, exceeding quarterly and yearly targets.
So, by tweaking the knob, as it were, their bonuses were going up.
Correct.
Back in Houston, Enron's young masters of the universe were reaping the rewards of their company's pumped-up earnings. The front porch bar near the Enron HQ was a popular hangout. As Enron's businesses ventured into ever more exotic areas, so too did the staff. Trips to lap dancing clubs and even further afield became legendary.
Oh my God, happy hour every other night it seemed like, going out, expense accounts, just spending whatever. We went on trips to Vegas, like every 6 months it seemed like, all paid for. We even went on a trip, a customer appreciation trip. We flew them all into Vegas, stayed at the Paris for 3 or 4 days. You can imagine what kind of, party we had up there. And so that's the lifestyle we had.
But staff extravagances were eclipsed by the country club lifestyles of Enron's top brass. In 1997, Jeff Skilling was promoted to Chief Operating Officer. He later moved here to Houston's swankiest district. Ken Lay lived in this luxury penthouse downtown, except when he was at one of his 17 other properties. Both men made tens of millions of dollars by cashing in some of their Enron shares.
I see.
Lots of Enron executives were minting it. This man, Lou Pai, made $350 million. Publicly, he admits neither guilt nor regret.
Not feeling anything.
The deceptions continued. One day in 1998, the ever-inventive Skilling and Lay were expecting a visit from financial analysts at their Houston tower. They wanted to show off a new dealing room, but it wasn't ready yet.
They wanted to impress the analysts, so Jeff Skilling had them find an open spot where they could get people to come in and pretend like it was a trading floor.
I see.
Skilling and Lay demanded that secretaries and other non-traders pretend to do deals by phone. The woman who would later become Margaret Sacconi's assistant was in charge of setting it up.
I asked her, what were you thinking? Did you not think there was something wrong with pretending to have a trading floor, and she's like, you know, I really didn't think anything of it. They asked me to do it, and why would they ask me to do something that wouldn't be right?
Enron is a company that deals with everyone with absolute integrity.
By the late 1990s, it was all becoming very precarious. Despite the illusion of big profits, in reality, Enron had ballooning debts. Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling needed a quick fix. Andrew Fastow was their willing disciple. As Enron's chief financial officer, he conjured up just what they needed.
Andy Fastow's a guy who wanted to please his superiors. And it appears that he was willing to do whatever was necessary to get the job done, even if it required much more aggressive practices that did cross that line between legal and not legal.
Fastow's plan was to set up a dizzyingly complex web of strange-sounding companies, thousands of them. They needed names, so he called some after his favourite Star Wars characters like Chewbacca, others after carnivorous dinosaurs. Whereas before Enron had plucked profits out of thin air by using mark-to-market accounting, this scheme hid their real debts under the carpet. It took a professor of economics to make sense of it all. He started by giving every company a box.
There were 4,300 boxes, but we ran out of blackboard. This is a drastic simplification. All of these are accounting maneuvers. Most of them appear to be designed simply to either hide debts or to create very, very controversial earnings. We've not yet found a single one of these transactions that appears to match a real business purpose.
For Enron, this was all about keeping up appearances. Like car showroom salesmen, Lay and Skilling wanted Enron's public image to be as shiny as possible. But the reality was that some of their deals were more like this. They were rusty old bangers, uneconomic, leaking cash, and would have ruined Enron's image.
Imagine this old wreck is, I don't know, some foreign power station that's losing value. It's threatening to damage profits and hit the share price. So, what do Enron do? They park it well out of sight.
It was so neat. Enron tucked away unwanted businesses in their obscure subsidiaries. In America, the rules say that if a parent company sells just 3% of a subsidiary to outside investors, it doesn't have to declare the debts on its own books. Even though the parent still owns 97%, the subsidiary is seen as independent.
But of course the garage, or subsidiary company, wasn't really independent. Basically, Enron still owned it. And because of this ruse, they were able to conceal their debts and further inflate their profits.
Eventually, Enron parked $27 billion of bad businesses in dubious subsidiaries. The scheme went even further. When Enron sold their loss-making businesses to their own subsidiaries, they'd charge a very high price and book it as profit, even though they were effectively doing a deal with themselves. And they took this to absurd lengths. Tens of millions of dollars of earnings claimed in their accounts would have been physically impossible to produce.
Cuiabá, pardon my Portuguese, is a power plant in the depths of the Amazon jungle. Enron proposed building the plant and fueling it from a pipeline from Venezuela. Now, the enthralling part of this is that the pipeline that was carrying the gas wasn't finished. So they created $65 million of profit for a product that couldn't even arrive at the plant. There was no way an investor could have known that. There was no way that fuel could have moved. This is the actual definition of a sham.
The deals were discussed and passed at board meetings. The board agreed that Andrew Fastow should run the subsidiaries. They even waived Enron's code of conduct, which banned an employee from doing deals with a company he also controlled. Why did the directors let this pass?
This was a very well-paid board. Many people were making $300,000 to $380,000 a year as a board member. And that perhaps influenced judgments. This board let this company get away with murder.
So what about the company's own watchdogs like Lord Wakeham? He was a chartered accountant who sat on the audit committee. Wakeham's job was to scrutinise the way the books were prepared. He collected £80,000 a year as a director and £48,000 in consultancy fees. Apparently, neither he nor his colleagues realised what was happening.
Lord Wakeham, a very decent person, I'm sure, was someone who probably was miscast for this particular role. You needed some people who had a really hands-on, intimate knowledge of all the issues at hand. And Enron was right at the borderline of legality in so many things.
The outside world was also under Enron's spell. The financial media lavished praise on the company. It made Fortune magazine's Most Admired list year after year. And the ultimate accolade, Andrew Fastow won a prize for capital structure management from Chief Financial Officers magazine. But all this depended on a rising share price, and for that, Enron also needed to convince the research analysts who recommend shares. Veteran analyst John Olson has told Congress how Enron bribed and bullied Wall Street.
Enron paid out lots of investment banking fees. The bankers loved Enron. Enron loved analyst strong buy recommendations. Guess what happened? It got them. Lots of them. This is an abuse.
Analysts are meant to give an independent view, but they're employed by the banks who would benefit from Enron's business. Enron made it absolutely clear analysts had to recommend their shares if their firms hoped to get lucrative contracts. Ken Lay made it quite explicit by keeping a scorecard.
He used the scorecard to reward various investment banking houses with a degree of enthusiasm that the analysts expressed for the company. The stronger the buy recommendation, the more investment banking business presumably you would have. This again was made known quite clearly to me and to my investment bankers. We had numerous disagreements over this particular position, and this is one of the reasons that I ultimately left the firm.
Having been forced out of one Wall Street firm, John Olson moved on to another, Merrill Lynch, and the very same thing happened all over again.
They essentially said you either have to come up with a strong buy recommendation or consider your options. I considered my options.
You left?
Yes.
So essentially you were hounded out by Enron's intimidation?
In a matter of speaking, yes.
Other firms have also dismissed analysts in similar circumstances. The company that sacked John Olson, Merrill Lynch, replaced him with an analyst who then issued a series of buy recommendations on Enron. Merrill went on to win the lucrative job of drumming up investors for yet another Enron-controlled company which hid debts and inflated profits. This time, Andrew Fastow named it LJM2 after his wife and kids' initials. LJM2 held a crucial meeting in Florida in October 2000. Fastow was the host. The guest speaker was Jeff Skilling. Merrill Lynch was there too, and as these documents show, so was half of Wall Street. The big investment banks were now being offered generous rewards for helping to conceal Enron's debts.
The attendance at that meeting was stellar. We had senior management of Enron present, Jeff Skilling. We had the Enron staff present. We also had representatives of some of the major financial houses in the US and Europe.
The investment bankers were told that the purpose of LJM2 was to once more buy up Enron businesses which were not making enough money and undermining the share price. The Wall Street firms were promised fabulous rates of return. So good, many of the bankers also invested millions personally.
The bottom line was that they went over a series of transactions that were exceedingly beneficial to the investors. It was their presence that was being bought, not their true financial participation. There was no economic substance to many of these transactions.
Andrew Fastow himself made $30 million from the subsidiaries, and they did the trick for Enron as well. In the year 2000, the company declared profits of almost $1 billion, and shares hit $90, their all-time peak. But it wouldn't last much longer. Enron may have bought Wall Street's silence, but inside the company, some people were asking difficult questions. One was high-flyer Margaret Saccone. In November 2000, she was headhunted by Enron on the promise of big bucks, but she quickly began to question Enron's way of doing business.
I came to realize that the value proposition we were putting together was all a bet, and that there really was no substance behind it. It was like gambling. It was Las Vegas at its finest. It was totally a crapshoot.
In early 2001, Margaret noticed that lots of Enron executives were leaving, whilst many others were selling large amounts of stock. Then she realized something was wrong. Her division of the company was hiding huge losses.
I knew we had been booking deals at losses, and there were rumors going around that we were losing money on all these deals. And then the June month-end came around, and to everyone's amazement, we reported earnings. And no one could figure out where the losses went and what had gone on. And at that point, then it was disclosed that we were merging the risk department into another division that was much more profitable, and it was obvious that we were hiding losses.
In July, Margaret anonymously called the Securities and Exchange Commission to check on the accounting rules. She was also trying to warn her friends in the company, but to no avail.
Everybody thought I was crazy and told me so. And they're like, Margaret, this is Enron. This is the greatest company there is. You don't know what you're talking about. And the biggest one was that a lot of people at Enron love to use is, you just don't get it. I'm like, I get it. I don't think y'all do.
In August, Margaret Saccone was made redundant, along with the rest of her department. Weeks later, Jeff Skilling resigned, citing personal reasons. It was then that Margaret wrote to Kenneth Lay and the rest of the board to tell them $500 million in losses had been hidden in another part of the company. She got no reply.
I think all the bosses knew what was going on. If I knew at my level what was going on, how could they not know? Jeff Skilling, everybody knew, was really the financial mastermind of the company, and I just think, and then everybody else reported up into him. But there's just no doubt that senior management had to be aware of what was going on because people at the lower levels knew what was going on.
In October, Margaret formally reported her worries to the Securities and Exchange Commission. There were other whistleblowers, but she was the only one to go to the federal authorities. That same month, they started to investigate. Enron's Conjuring Act was getting decidedly shaky. Andrew Fastow was sacked in October. Then the company tripped up over the rule it had made so much use of.
Enron was living by the pen. As it turns out, they died by the pen. To make all of this work, this box had to own 3% of that box. We don't yet know why, but for some reason they didn't do that. Once they failed to do that, Arthur Andersen demanded that this box be combined with that box. The outcome of that was a $1.2 billion reduction in stockholder equity. That was the first step in the avalanche that led to the investigations, the stock price collapse, and finally the bankruptcy.
Enron borrowed billions more, but couldn't save itself. They'd been rumbled. The share price started to free fall, and the biggest victims were certainly not the bosses.
I feel terrible about what happened to the employees. I think if you
Lay and Skilling had encouraged employees like Angelina Lario to invest more and more of their savings in Enron's stock. After 28 years loyal service, she's ended up losing $500,000. That's everything, and she still owes $75,000 on her mortgage. She's 59.
When I watch Jeff Skilling at the congressional hearings on TV, I'm so angry, I'm overwhelmed because I'm lucky if I can live another 10 years and, you know, I wanted to be able to enjoy. My daughter's 15 years old and I wanted to be able to enjoy her in 3.5 years. We could go places, do things, go on vacations that I've sacrificed, you know, during the years that we weren't able to. But now that's all abruptly come to an end because of Enron and their thieves.
In the morning, my car was the last car to leave at night. I had a clear imbalance in my priorities in life. That is the reason I left the company. I did not leave the company because I thought the company was in imminent financial danger.
That's a big, big lie that he is telling the whole world. He knew, because he made all of his $66 million and then a lot more, I'm sure. He's outright lying, you know. He's trying to fool the whole world, and everyone sees right through him.
In mid-October, Enron heard they were being investigated. Shortly after, staff of both Enron and accountants Arthur Andersen went on a 3-week orgy of document shredding. Andersen deny any corporate wrongdoing, but the actions of their staff suggest they thought they had something to hide. So did Congress when it grilled the Andersen partner in charge of the Enron audit.
Mr. Duncan, Enron robbed the bank. Arthur Andersen provided the getaway car, and they say you were at the wheel.
Not only were Andersen raking in $25 million a year as auditors for Enron, but they were being paid the same again as consultants. On the one hand, they were meant to be keeping Enron on the straight and narrow. On the other, helping it dodge costs. Could greed have clouded their judgment?
If you noticed discrepancies and problems in the books, surely Andersen's should have done.
Well, you would think for a $50 million fee, somebody might have picked up on it.
Andersen was one of the big 5 accounting firms. Now it's fighting for its life. But it wasn't only Andersen who enabled Enron to get away with it for so long. The board of directors failed to control the company's executives. The audit committee on which Lord Wakeham served apparently failed to grasp what was happening. Regulators exempted Enron from scrutiny, politicians were paid, and Wall Street was bribed and bullied into complicity. Corporate America is now going through an intense period of soul-searching.
People all over the country, in boardrooms of companies large and small, want to know, have our books been honest? Are we reporting the way it really is? Have we overstated in the past?
I do.
But ultimate responsibility lies with Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling, Enron's architects.
During my time at Enron, I was immensely proud of what we accomplished.
They forced through an accounting system which was easy to manipulate and a staff incentive scheme which guaranteed that many employees would oblige. The top executives themselves made hundreds of millions of dollars. So was it fraud from the start? That's up to the investigators to prove.
I think that they were deliberate and they wanted to be able to grow as fast as they could and show profits as fast as they could, but I don't think that they realized that at some point in time this would catch up to them and it would be revealed that this wasn't the way you run a business.
We sacrificed, we saved, and now it's all lost because of their greed and their betrayal, their deceit, all the lies that they told us.
$100 billion has disappeared without a trace. It's quite possible it was never there to begin with.
It's a wild ride.